somebody drive me back to my Honda? I left it parked at the front gate.
Walk!
It means I'll have to sit around here all night.
What's wrong with spending a quiet evening at home for a change?
Imagine growing up as the son of one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses, watching your own face light up movie screens as a beloved character, and still not knowing for certain whose blood runs through your veins. That was a reality for Sean Astin, the boy the world first met as Mikey in the Goonies, and later came to know as the loyal Samwise Gamgee in The Lord of the Rings. Behind the fame and the family name was a question that took nearly 3 decades, 3 different men, and 1 DNA test to finally answer. This is the story of how Patty Duke's son found out who his real father was, and how that discovery reshaped, rather than destroyed, the meaning of family for everyone involved. Before this story can make sense, you have to understand who Patty Duke was, because the chaos that followed her son for years actually began with her. Patty Duke wasn't just a working actress. She was practically raised inside the entertainment industry from childhood, discovered as a young girl and pushed into a punishing schedule of auditions, sets, and public appearances before she was even a teenager. By 16, she had already reached a height most actors never come close to in an entire career. In 1962, she played Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker and won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, becoming one of the youngest Oscar winners in history at the time. From there, her fame only grew. The Patty Duke Show turned her into a household name, with millions of viewers tuning in weekly to watch her play 2 identical cousins with wildly different personalities. On screen, she was funny, charming, and effortlessly likable. Off-screen, her life told a very different story. Patty later revealed that the managers who controlled her early career had exploited her trust and overworked her for years, all while she had no real power to protect herself. It was a kind of exploitation that so many child stars of that era experienced quietly, with no one stepping in to intervene. As she moved into adulthood, new struggles surfaced. Patty experienced extreme, unexplained shifts in mood, energy, and behavior that neither she nor the people around her could make sense of at the time. It would be years before she received an accurate diagnosis of bipolar disorder, a condition she later spoke about publicly and became a genuine advocate for once treatment finally gave her some stability. But in the late 1960s and early 1970s, none of that understanding existed yet. She was simply living through wave after wave of emotional highs and devastating lows, often making major life decisions in the middle of them. Her romantic life mirrored that instability. Patty fell in love quickly, married just as quickly, and often watched those relationships collapse within weeks. It wasn't unusual for her to be involved with more than one man at a time, swept up in the intensity of the moment without fully processing the consequences. That pattern set the stage for the single most complicated chapter of her life, the birth of her first son, and the mystery of who his father truly was. None of this is meant to paint Patty as reckless or careless. By the time she reached adulthood, she had spent nearly her entire life inside an industry that profited from her talent, while offering almost nothing in the way of genuine protection or care. She had been performing since childhood, managed by adults who prioritized her earning potential over her well-being, and thrust into adult decisions long before she had the tools to navigate them. Given all of that, it's perhaps not surprising that her 20s became a period of searching, instability, and impulsive choices. She was, in many ways, still trying to figure out who she was outside of the roles she had been playing since she was a small child. On February 25, 1971, Patty gave birth to a son she initially named Sean Patrick Duke. Under normal circumstances, a birth like this would have simply been a happy chapter in a young actress's life. Instead, it triggered a scandal that tabloids couldn't get enough of, because Patty herself wasn't entirely certain who the father was. In the months leading up to the birth, Patty had been connected romantically to more than one man. Her relationships overlapped, her memory of the exact timeline was unreliable, and her mental health, still undiagnosed and untreated, made everything even murkier. She wasn't trying to deceive anyone. She was simply a young woman in genuine turmoil, trying to make sense of her own life while the entire country watched and speculated. The press ran with the uncertainty, printing theory after theory, and young Sean was, quite literally, born into a paternity mystery before he ever said his first word. To understand how tangled the situation became, it helps to look at each of the 3 men who were, at different points, considered to be Sean's father. The first was Michael Tell, a man almost nobody outside Patty's inner circle had heard of. Tell worked as a music promoter and had been subletting Patty's apartment during an especially unstable period in her life. Their connection was brief and casual, nothing close to a serious relationship. When Patty discovered she was pregnant and grew anxious about how the press would react, she made an impulsive decision. She married Michael Tell in a quiet civil ceremony, hoping to shield herself from further scandal. The marriage lasted only 13 days before it was annulled. For years afterward, Patty insisted the marriage had never even been consummated and firmly denied that Tell could be the child's father. He faded out of the story almost as quickly as he had entered it, or so everyone assumed at the time. The second man was Desi Arnaz Jr., son of television legends Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. Senior, their relationship became a genuine tabloid sensation, partly because of his young age and partly because his famous mother was reportedly unhappy about the pairing. Lucille Ball was said to have disapproved strongly, worried about her teenage son being pulled into what looked like a chaotic, high-profile romance. For a long stretch of Sean's early life, Patty told her son that Desi was his biological father, and the timeline of their relationship made that explanation plausible enough for people to accept. Desi never publicly confirmed or denied the claim. He mostly stayed silent and let the story exist without his direct involvement. The third man was John Astin, an actor best known for playing Gomez Addams on The Addams Family. In the mid-1970s, Patty married John, and together they raised Sean as a family. John legally adopted the boy, giving him the Astin name that the world would come to know. To young Sean, John wasn't a stepfather in any emotional sense. He was simply Dad. The two had a second son together, Mackenzie Astin, who also went on to become an actor, and for a stretch of years the family appeared settled, even happy, despite the shaky beginning. What made the situation so difficult wasn't just that there were three possible fathers. It was that Patty's own account of the story kept shifting over time. She would tell Sean one thing, then later contradict herself and point towards someone else entirely. To outsiders, that inconsistency might have looked like dishonesty or manipulation, but those who understood her mental health struggles saw it differently. Patty wasn't lying to her son. She was genuinely uncertain, her memory clouded by years of untreated bipolar disorder and emotional chaos of that period in her life. She loved Sean deeply, but she simply could not hand him a clean, definitive answer, no matter how badly she wanted to. While all of this uncertainty simmered in the background, Sean Astin was busy building a career of his own, and he did it without leaning on his mother's fame or courting the same kind of tabloid attention that had defined her early years. Audiences first fell for him as Mikey in The Goonies, a role that turned him into a familiar face for an entire generation. Unlike many child actors of that era, Sean didn't flame out. He kept working steadily, taking on roles that showed range without chasing headlines. His career reached a new level when he was cast as Samwise Gamgee in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. While much of the pre-release was focused on stars like Elijah Wood and Viggo Mortensen, it was Sean's performance as a loyal, big-hearted Sam that many fans and critics singled out once the films were released. Long before that, Sean had also quietly built industry respect behind the camera, directing and co-producing the short film Kangaroo Court, which earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Live-Action Short Film in 1995, a detail many casual fans don't even know about. Years later, he found a new generation of viewers through his role in Stranger Things. Despite all that success, Sean never used his mother's fame or his own complicated family story as a way to generate publicity. He built his career on steady, respected work. But privately, the question of his paternity never fully disappeared. It sat quietly in the background of his life, waiting for the moment he would finally decide to confront it head-on. Away from film sets, Sean was also busy building the kind of stable home life that had eluded his mother for so many years. In 1992, he married Christine Harrell, and the couple went on to raise 3 daughters together. Friends and colleagues who knew him during this period often described him as grounded and family-oriented, the kind of person who showed up for school plays and family dinners the same way he showed up for premieres. In many ways, the traditional, steady household he built for his own children stood in quiet contrast to the unpredictable childhood he had lived through himself. It wasn't something he talked about often, but those close to him understood that his commitment to stability at home was, at least in part, shaped by everything he had witnessed growing up. As Sean grew older, the story he had been told as a child started to feel less solid. He had grown up believing John Aston was his biological father, the man who raised him, taught him, and was there for the ordinary milestones of childhood. Then, as a teenager, his mother told him that Desi Arnaz Jr. was actually his biological father instead. It was a significant shift, one that reshaped how Sean understood his own identity, and he began building a relationship with Desi based on that belief. But the story didn't stay settled there either. Later in life, Sean crossed paths with a relative of Michael Tell, the man from that 13-day marriage decades earlier. That relative suggested there might be a family connection between them, a comment that reignited every question Sean thought had already been answered. Suddenly, a man who had barely registered as a footnote in the family's history was back in the picture as a real possibility. By this point, Sean had spent years absorbing different versions of the same story, each one sincerely believed by his mother at the time she told it. He loved her deeply and never doubted her intentions. But he also recognized that if he wanted a definitive answer, one grounded in fact rather than memory or emotion, he was going to have to find it himself. There's something worth pausing on here. Unlike so many paternity stories that play out as bitter, adversarial battles, this one never really carried that tone. Sean wasn't trying to catch his mother in a lie or expose some hidden betrayal for the cameras. He was a grown man, already established in his career and his own family life, simply trying to close a gap in his personal history that had never quite closed on its own. That distinction matters, because it shaped how he approached every step of the process that followed, from the initial conversations with each man to the quiet, private way he eventually processed the results once they arrived. Sean's decision to pursue a DNA test wasn't driven by anger or resentment toward his mother. It came from a much simpler, more human place. He wanted to know who he actually was. So he reached out to all three men who had, at various points, been named as his possible biological father, John Aston, Desi Arnaz Jr., and Michael Tell, a man he barely knew at all by that point. Tell had been out of the family's orbit for decades, a distant name attached to a marriage that had ended before it ever really began. To his credit, every man agreed to take the test. There was no resistance, no drama, no attempt to avoid the truth. Once the samples were submitted, all Sean could do was wait, and that waiting period stretched out with a strange mix of anxiety and relief. Part of him was nervous about what the results might reveal, wondering whether the answer would upend relationships he had spent a lifetime building. But another part of him welcomed the process, because after decades of shifting stories, he was finally going to get something solid to stand on. When the DNA results finally arrived, they confirmed something almost no one had expected. Michael Tell, the man from the brief, largely forgotten 13-day marriage, was Sean's biological father, not John Aston, the man who raised him, not Desi Arnaz Jr., the man he had spent years believing was his biological parent. Michael Tell, a name that had all but disappeared from the family story, turned out to be the missing piece. For Sean, the moment wasn't devastating. It was clarifying. He later summed up his identity simply and directly in an interview with People magazine, explaining that John Aston was his father in every way that mattered, while Michael Tell was his biological father. That distinction became the foundation of how Sean chose to move forward. The discovery didn't diminish his love for John Aston in any way. If anything, it deepened his appreciation for man, because now the relationship stood on its own terms, built entirely on love, presence, and years of genuine parenting rather than biology alone. Once the results were confirmed, Sean faced an unusual challenge. How do you begin a relationship with a biological father you barely know, decades after the fact? By all accounts, the process was handled with a surprising amount of grace on both sides. Michael Tell didn't resist Sean's outreach or try to distance himself from the situation. He wasn't a public figure, had never sought fame, and spent decades living a quiet, private life away from Hollywood entirely. When Sean reached out, Tell responded with openness rather than avoidance, and the two slowly built a real connection. Sean has spoken about their relationship with genuine warmth, describing Tell as someone he holds real affection for and expressing that he doesn't blame anyone involved in the situation, not his mother, not any of the men, for how things unfolded. Michael Tell, for his part, never tried to insert himself into the relationship Sean already had with John Aston or Desi Arnaz Jr. He simply became part of the picture, without disrupting what already existed, allowing all three relationships to coexist naturally rather than compete with one another. It's worth remembering just how unusual Michael Tell's position in this story really was. He wasn't a celebrity, wasn't chasing a spotlight, and had spent decades of his life completely removed from the entertainment world that had defined Patty Duke's existence. For a private man who had likely assumed his brief, 13-day marriage to a famous actress was a closed chapter of his life, suddenly becoming central to his son's identity decades later must have been its own kind of surreal experience. Yet by every account, he met the moment with humility rather than hesitation, choosing connection over distance when he easily could have chosen the opposite. For Patty, the confirmed results force a reckoning with